In the next part of this video about the Pacific, we'll look at the aftermath of this battle and introduce some models and talk about the next series that we'll be presenting in Tiger Hobbies D-Day to VJ Day series. The Battle for Iwo Jima, the toughest battle fought by the United States Marines in World War II. It resulted in 26,000 US casualties and almost 21,000 Japanese, which is staggering to say the battlefield is so small. It would also be the first time the US had suffered more casualties than the Japanese in an island assault. It was also a terrible foretaste of what was to come on the island of Okinawa, which was much larger island and against a larger, more fanatical enemy, if that's possible. The Japanese fought almost to the very last man, with only 200 out of 21,000 getting off the island alive. It didn't matter how many lessons the US Navy had learned about overwhelming force at sea and in the air if the poor grunt of the Marines had to go through hell fighting the Japanese on these islands. And in fact, the Japanese were possibly the most fanatical enemy in the history of modern warfare. In the Battle of Iwo Jima, the US forces were awarded 27 Medals of Honor for heroism. Admiral Nimitz coined the phrase on Iwo Jima, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue about the US Marines that fought on Iwo Jima." It also left the US forces and senior personnel questioning just how many of them would have to die before they subdued the Japanese. It also made them look into their cold black hearts for another way of killing them without atrocious Allied losses. It was estimated in war modelling that more than 1 million Allied casualties would be expected if they had to invade the Japanese main islands. The US, strangely, never signed up to the Geneva Convention limiting the use of chemical weapons until 1975, so in theory they were free to use them in the Pacific or in World War II. On the fringes of the Pacific campaign, the US stored vast amounts of mustard and phosgene bombs in places like India and later Australia and forward holdings in Okinawa. One of the last things that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did before he died was try to keep a lid on the potential use of chemical weapons by the US forces against Japan, other than if Japan used them against US forces. Remember, the Japanese have been using chemical weapons against the Chinese during their battle with the Chinese forces, and they've done that a number of times. But by early 1945, as we know now, the US were well on the way to getting the atomic bomb. But even in this late stage of the war, very few knew about this weapon. In fact, the Vice President, Harry S. Truman, was totally in the dark about this bomb and did not find out until the day he stepped into the Oval Office as President of the United States after the death of FDR in April 1945. Some say he was not an happy bunny. When we talk about chemical weapons, the US forces throughout World War II were followed round by usually ships full of chemical bombs. In an incident in December 1943 in the Italian port city of Bari, an American cargo ship whose crew were told to tell nobody what was on that ship docked in Bari, and then there was a German air raid. And unfortunately, if an aircraft drops a bomb on a ship full of bombs, it's only going to result in one thing: an absolute catastrophic explosion that killed all the crew, every one of them, so nobody could speak. Within hours, hundreds and hundreds of Italian civilians were dying in strange kinds of ways. And it wasn't until a senior US Army medical officer who had experience in chemical warfare knew exactly what was happening and traced the chemicals to the ship. This incident was covered up until possibly the 1970s. Yes, chemical weapons may not have been used by the Allies, but were certainly in production and being stored and being transported throughout the campaigns of World War II. Tiger Hobbies, as stated, will do another 2 episodes on the Pacific. Next will be the Southwest Pacific, up to Okinawa, including the British Pacific Fleet. and then the development of the atomic bomb and the end of the war. But our next series will be going back to Europe. As you have noticed, in the background we've had a Canadian maple flag, Old Glory, and even a Japanese rising sun in the early part of this series. So it's time to have the Union flag as we look at the British Army from the end of the Scheldt estuary battles and including the crossing the Rhine in March 1945 in Operation Plunder.